Hi, everyone. My name is Tanya Hertz. I'm Assistant Professor of Entrepreneurship and Business at San Diego Miramar College and San Diego State University. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about generational cohorts and how those cohorts can have an impact on business. So I'm going to go ahead and open up a PowerPoint slide that I have on generational cohorts. And let's talk about the different cohorts and talk about why we spend so much time actually covering them in business. So first of all, a generational cohort is defined as the individuals or people who experience the same event at the same time interval. And when we're looking at when they're experiencing those events, what we're talking about is typically when the people are coming of age in this particular group, when they're becoming adults, as they're teenagers and really getting to know the world. Not necessarily what happens when they're born, but when they're coming of age. And it's based on the notion that a group of people bound together by sharing the same sort of common historical experience tend to behave the same. And so they tend to behave the same when they work, and when they play, and when they purchase things. And so we pay attention to this because in business, we need to manage people from different backgrounds, different generational cohorts, and we also need to sell to people in different generational cohorts. So it's important that we understand the different cohorts. So the first generational cohort, and I do need to say this before I move any further, is that you'll notice in different studies that the beginning and ending ages or years of the different cohorts is sometimes a little bit different, and that's because it's research based. So whatever it is that we're studying, if that pushes somebody into one cohort or another, that might be why it's a little bit fluid. Excuse me, I've had this cough for a while. Don't feel sick anymore, but the cough just won't go away. Okay, start with the traditionalists. They were typically born between 1925 and 1945. You may not be working with a whole lot of people from this particular generational cohort, but in case you do, some things to know about them, that that this particular generation tends to be very conservative. They tend to have a very rigid sort of view of a family. They came of age in very socially, when social programs were being established, things like Social Security. They came of age during things like World War II, which had a big impact on the way that they behave and the way that they tend to be a lot more frugal than a lot of the other generations. They tend to be more conservative because of things like that. Now, the baby boomers, chances are there's higher probability chances that you'll be working with boomers. Boomers, there's two cohorts within the boomers, but we'll just kind of group them together for the purposes of this lecture. They're typically born between 1946 and 1964. They came of age during big social changes. They were the first generation to be called the me generation. They were the generation that fought for social change. They saw things like the Vietnam War, the draft. They saw things when they were coming of age like Martin Luther King being shot. They saw the man on the moon, moon landing altogether on television. And this generation tends to be, they tend to identify very closely with what they do for a living. This generation was the first generation to really see a large number of women enter the workforce. Now, we saw women enter the workforce in traditionalists, but it was a little bit briefer, and it really had to do more with the fact that the men were off at war. We saw women actually entering the workforce, boomer women entering the workforce much more than men as a career choice. And that had a lot to do with the fact that this generation was the first generation to actually have access to birth control. So they could delay having children if they wanted to, and they could choose to work, and a lot of them did that. This generation, baby boomers, they are working longer. And that there's a lot of reasons why they're working longer. Part of it, like I said, they really identify closely with what they do for a living. They like what they do for a living. They're not like the millennials who really want that work-life balance where they live to work, not work to live, right? The baby boomers are also not leaving because, as a lot of them were reaching retirement age, and a large portion of them are reaching retirement age, it was right when we had that giant financial crisis. And so they lost a large portion of their wealth. More than 50% of boomers' wealth was wiped out in that horrible financial crisis. So the next generation that we saw was Gen Xers. So Gen Xers, these are also called the latchkey kids, the MTV generation. They call them the latchkey kids because this generation, more than half of their parents divorced, and maybe because their parents were all wanting to work now. And so they were called also the latchkey generation because their parents were at work. Both parents, for a lot of them, were at work and had to work. And so they would have a key around their neck, and their babysitter at the end of the day was the television. And therefore there's that MTV generation. Generation Xers are very comfortable with technology. They grew up while they were coming of age. They came of age with personal computers. They came of age during the fall of the Berlin Wall. They saw, as a generation, a lot of them saw the Challenger explosion together. This generation tends to be very individualistic more than any of the other generations. They tend to be very entrepreneurial. They tend to be pragmatic. They tend to be very distrusting, especially of people of authority. This was the first so I didn't say this before, baby boomers were the first generation to experiment on a large scale with recreational drug use. And Gen Xers were the first generation to be exposed to the Say No to Drug campaign, Reaganism, right? And so that might have something to do with their distrust of people in positions of authority. And they tend to also be less formal than boomers and traditionalists. They tend to be a little more informal, and that might have something to do with the fact or why they tend to be entrepreneurs. What else was it? Oh, I didn't tell you why we call them different names. Traditionalists, it makes sense. They're very traditional. This is the greatest generation. They went off and fought World War II. Baby boomers, we called them baby boomers because everybody who went off to war in World War II, when they came back, they started having babies like crazy. There was a huge population explosion, and that population explosion, we called them the boomers, baby boomers, right? Gen X, we call them Gen Xers because it's actually a marketing term, and the X in a mathematical equation is the unknown, and Gen Xers were like that X in a mathematical equation. We just could not figure out how to market to these people in such a way that they would behave the way that we thought they should behave, right? Marketers tried everything they could to sell to this generation, and this generation just shrugged their shoulders and rolled their eyes and said whatever, right? So millennials are the next generation, next big generation. Millennials are the generation that became even more comfortable with technology. They were exposed to technology from a very young age, if not birth. The millennials they had personal computers in their homes. They tend to be very comfortable also because of that with technology. Millennials, some of their shared sort of cultural experiences, as many of you know, things like 9/11. They went through the worst historical financial crisis since the traditionalists saw the Great Depression. And so they tend to be a lot more traditional and a lot more frugal because they saw what could happen or what happens when systems fall apart. This generation, the millennials, tend to be very tolerant of people from different backgrounds, and that's because they, more than any other generation, grew up with people from different backgrounds, from diverse backgrounds. They're very, very comfortable with diversity. If you're managing millennials, you don't have to spend a lot of time teaching them how to get along with other people. They're called millennials because of that, because of when they came of age during the shift to the new millennium. Millennials, also sometimes we call them Gen Y, and they call them Gen Y because Y is after X, so I think millennial maybe is better than Y, but who knows if a lot of them don't like that term, but that's what's stuck right now, so we're using it. Millennials really value work-life balance. They understand the importance of working, but they also understand the importance of not working and having fun. And they love jobs that give them freedom. They do tend to be entrepreneurial as well. They have this I think, an unfair bad rap of being self-centered. And I think that every generation has gotten that label at some point of being self-centered. And it's just because at that particular time they were self-centered because they're coming of age, but we grow out of that. And so I don't think that's a really fair representation for millennials. One thing that might be a little bit more fair is this is also, they're sometimes known as the participation generation, because they were the first generation to ever get sort of like a prize for participating. You didn't need to win the race to get a trophy as a millennial, apparently. You just by being in the race, you would get a trophy. And so they tend to really like a lot of feedback from their managers, and they're not afraid of feedback. If you talk to a Gen Xer and give them feedback, Gen Xers love autonomy for the most part. They want to be left alone, right? They don't want to talk to anybody. They're very, very individualistic. Millennials, they don't mind talking. They want to hear what you have to say to them. One thing, millennials were mostly raised by baby boomers, and the baby boomers really wanted to have a peer-like relationship with their children, and so they would chat with their children as equals. And so millennials will often will speak to people in positions of power in an organization as if they're on the same level, which can be off-putting to people in different generations. So be aware of that. Not everybody's as comfortable with the egalitarian sort of way of life as millennials are. And finally, iGen is the most recent generation that's really been sort of labeled. It's called a lot of different things. Who knows what's going to stick? Right now we're calling it iGen. It's also sometimes called Gen Z, because Z is after Y. Come on, be creative, people here. But it's also called iGen because this generation was so comfortable with their technology. They grew up as infants with an iPhone, an iPad, or an iPod in their hands, right? They were very, very comfortable with technology. Unfortunately, this generation tends to be a highly medicated generation, perhaps because of what's going on with big pharma in this country, but this generation also, but it could also have something to do with the fact that this generation tends to be a somewhat depressed generation, and that might have to do with the fact that they're on their screens so much. There's been correlative studies shown that the higher amount of screen time, the more depressed people can be, and this generation is on their screens a lot. This generation, the iGen, tends to be very uncomfortable with adult situations. They really put off adulthood more than any other generation. They don't, even when they get old enough to get a driver's license, they don't get a driver's license. They're old enough to get a job, they don't get a job. And a lot of that might have to do with the fact that a lot of this generation had helicopter parents who hovered over them and oversaw everything that they did or do. This generation tends to be very accepting of people from no matter what background they are, very, very tolerant of people from different socioeconomic backgrounds. They really care about the individual more than the societal group. What else about iGens and also millennials that I wanted to say? I was going to say something else. Group inclusion, very comfortable with diversity. Trying to think if there's anything that we missed about any of the generations. I don't know, maybe that's enough for now to say about them. There's so much, you can say so much about all of these generations, but it's important now for you to think about these differences. I also want to talk to you a little bit about projections. So they're usually done in 10-year cycles, but by 2022, we're going to see a growth of the workforce. And it's important to note that workers 55 and up are the fastest growing age group of any of the generational cohorts. And in terms of their overall percentage population in the working economy. And that's because they're staying working longer. And so as business professionals, that means we have to think about working with these older workers, motivating older workers whose careers may have plateaued. Think about things like rising healthcare costs, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see, here's the age distribution over that 10-year period. The workers 55 and up are the yellow workers. So they're not the biggest portion of the workforce. I want to make sure that I said that clearly. They're the fastest growing portion of the workforce, not the biggest portion of the overall workforce. There was something else I wanted to say about iGens, and I'm trying to remember what it is about. There was something else I wanted to say about they're comfortable with technology. I can't think about what it was. Well, maybe if you think of it, leave in the comments or something like this. But hope you enjoyed this lecture. Hope it give you something to think about when you're working with people from the different generations, or when you're selling to the different generations, how the different generations behave. If you are working with people from different generations, remember they behave differently, and so think about the best way to reach them, and think about the best way to not alienate this generation. Oh, I know. I wanted to say one thing about, because we were talking about technology. This is what finally comes back to me. Yes. So even though people from different generations like millennials, Gen Xers, iGens are more comfortable with technology, it doesn't mean that baby boomers are not smart when it comes to technology, or they don't want to use technology. When we research and we look at this, they do want to use technology. They understand it when they're taught it. It's just not second nature to them. They didn't grow up with it in their hands, and so it becomes difficult for them. So it's important that we get rid of some of the stereotypes about the different generations. That, baby boomers think that millennials are self-centered, and millennials think that baby boomers are technologically inept. Come on. These things aren't true. These are stereotypes. Now, one last thing I will say about stereotypes. What are we doing when we're talking about cohort analysis? We're stereotyping. Any research is essentially stereotyping. It's making assumptions about the individual based on the way that the group behaves, but we have to do it in order to move forward. So I hope that these kind of things are useful to you, to kind of give you an overall idea of how people might behave. But remember, we're all individuals. We're all people with our own values, our own ideas, our own way of behaving and thinking. And just because I say that millennials want a work-life balance and want to work from home more than maybe a baby boomer does, that doesn't mean that everybody feels the same way. Oh, and one other thing I wanted to say about iGens, it just came to me, is that we notice that iGen is the generation more than any other that's getting a college education, even though it's so expensive. And the reason, which is really interesting, that I thought it was really interesting, is that they get the education for the job, not for just its education's own sake, where a lot of Gen Xers did that, or Gen Xers went back to school because they wanted to grow and to learn more. So I thought that was interesting. But back to what I was saying, back to my original point, please remember that this is just gives us an idea when we're working with different generations, but we're all individuals and we all think differently and behave differently. So get to know one another when we're working with one another. And I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next video. Take care.